Hi, it's Beth Comstock. Thanks for joining in to our Changemakers Book Club. The reason we're doing this is for a couple of reasons. I think all of us are trying to figure out how do we navigate the world with so much innovation, change. Many of us, like me, love books, love people who can bring these stories to life, and need to understand sort of the past to the present to the future. And so we thought, who better than Stephen Johnson to help us weave the past to the present to the future. A big fan of your work, so thanks.
Beth.
It's a
Thank
real
you for having
treat.
me. This is great.
It's a real treat, and we've asked everybody to read Wonderland, or at least
Everyone on Facebook has read
everyone on
Wonderland.
Facebook. All 1.5 billion of us
That's
are reading this simultaneously, and it's a great read. So thank you. Thanks a lot. First of all, just maybe summarize a couple of thoughts. I mean, what led you to write Wonderland?
Yeah, Wonderland came out of a project that I did a couple years ago called How We Got to Now, which was a book and a PBS series about the history of innovation. And it was looking at all these elements of the modern world that we kind of take for granted, like electric light, for instance, something familiar to the history of GE, and tracing the history of where these technologies or innovations came from and all their kind of unintended consequences. And so that was a really fun project to do, and I wanted to do kind of a sequel of sorts to that, because you could write 50 books in that mode. But this time I wanted to have a kind of a macro argument, to make a macro argument on top of these kind of innovation histories. And the argument is that there is a surprisingly important role for what I call play in the subtitle of the book, but it includes delight and amusement and kind of wonder and all of these things. There's a surprisingly important role for play in the history of innovation, and the things that people initially did just for the fun of it, with no apparent reason or kind of utilitarian purpose. Those playful explorations have often led to world-changing ideas in science.
I mean,
and
that's what was so
technology.
amazing about the book. I mean, really, you're saying the future starts with play, and we all know innovation is very serious, but you're basically saying lighten up.
Yeah, right.
I think is a message I took from here. You talk a lot about the interconnectivity of ideas and it's a very global story that you tell. Maybe walk us through one of the best examples that you think brings this to life.
Well, there's a great story, actually. The book actually begins in Baghdad, more than 1,000 years ago, at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. And Baghdad at this point was really the most advanced city in the world and seat of incredible scholarship. And there was a place in Baghdad called the House of Wisdom, which was a lovely name. And it was this kind of mix of a think tank and a translation bureau and a kind of a maker lab, we would say now.
They had confidence in themselves too.
Right, exactly. And there were a group of engineers inside the House of Wisdom, and they would they built all these incredibly ahead of their time engineering projects that are documented in these books that we still have today, that are reproduced. Actually, some of the illustrations are reproduced in Wonderland, and they included these really advanced hydraulic systems, kind of flow regulation systems, like float valves, really advanced clocks, some of the most advanced engineering technologies the world had ever seen. And yet almost every object that they built was a toy.
Wow.
It was like a little automated
doll. They built
doll.
it as a toy.
And they built it as a toy.
Not
it was
because this is going to change the world.
It was like a little peacock that you could pull the feathers and water would come out, and fountains and a lot of automated musical instruments and things like that. And one of the things that they created was this thing called the instrument that plays itself. And it was basically an automated organ that you could get to play notes automatically by encoding the notes in a little pinned cylinder, like a rotating metallic cylinder with little pins corresponding to the notes, like a music box. And what was so radical about this idea, and again, this was just for amusement, just for delight, was that you could, if you wanted to change the notes that the instrument played, you could take out the cylinder, encode it with a new set of notes, and put it back in, and it would play completely different music. And
Sounds
so
like early coding.
it was the first programmable machine.
Huh.
And
what year was this?
This is 880. And so the whole idea between this separation between hardware and software becomes kind of imaginable at that point in time. And in fact, it stays alive in the world of music for almost 1,000 years before people start to think first about programming fabric, patterns of fabric, again, kind of delight and wonder and beauty. And then finally, people start to think about encoding digital information and programming in modern computers.
So you strike me, you have a very, I just reading your work and hearing you You have a very nimble mind,
Oh, I don't know that.
but you're able to make connections.
Right, right.
And have you always been that way, and you were able to bring that out in writing, or have you had to train yourself to make those connections? You know, what advice would you have for people trying to do what you do?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I'll have to ask my parents what I was like when I was little. I mean, I think what I've always had is, which is a wonderful trait to have, and something I think a lot about as a parent, actually, is curiosity. So that when I stumble into a new field, I just have a great kind of sense of like, oh, I have to learn everything I can about this.
You named your book Wonderland, but as I hear you talk about it, it's almost like you're Alice in Wonderland. You're like going down that rabbit hole, and you don't know what you're going to find.
When I was in my 20s, I had a pair of friends who were writing a screenplay, and they had a minor character that was based on me, and I was kind of comic relief in the screenplay. And the joke with that character is that no matter what anybody was talking about, my character would come in and say, "That is so interesting."
That's your meme. So we've asked people to submit questions, to have a dialogue. If something you say sparks a conversation, we're going to kind of come in and out. But one of the questions that came in is from Sepe Sahadi, and he basically builds on the idea we were just talking about. Is that he says, indeed, a number of world-changing machines were developed simply through trial and error, and not so much as to science. And what's the difference between trial and error and play, or is it the same thing?
Well, one of the things about play is there has to be, by definition, a certain level of surprise and having your expectations kind of challenged. So if you know this is the difference between games and kind of a fixed narrative, right? What makes a game interesting is you don't know what's going to happen. And that's why so many games involve chance, right? By definition, you have dice or you have cards because you need to have a level of unpredictability. And so when we play, we are opening ourselves up to experiences that are going to surprise us. And the fun of play, particularly the fun of playing a game, is developing kind of resilient, adaptive strategies to respond to unpredictable events. And so that's one of the reasons why play is so valuable, thinking about in terms of the classroom, because if you're trying to get people to learn things that they're just memorizing formulas, just passing down these facts while there's a lecture and a test is a great way to do it. If you're trying to get people to think creatively and respond to situations that you can't anticipate in advance, then play is a much better way to kind of train
I don't
the
know
mind.
if you've seen Hamilton. I mean, I think for me that I was like, I wish history could have been taught this way, right? I remember the songs. I love the character. So I think that idea. I'm going to quote some of your book. I mean, on page 95, you say, quote, "The networked nature of technical progress is that inventions are almost never solitary. It's not solitary, isolated creatures. They depend on other inventions that complete them, or endow them with new application their original inventor never considered." So I'm also hearing you talk about there's this iteration, but there's a collaboration and that's what strikes me about your book. What have you learned from that? Any lessons on collaboration?
Yeah, a lot of it is, what happens is someone will come up, or often a network of people will come up with an important invention in one field, and they'll be trying to solve a problem, maybe in a kind of direct way in one field, and it turns out that solution that they come up with can be borrowed by another field, seemingly unrelated to the initial field, and it kind of unlocks a new door of possibility that was hard to see before this other invention. So keeping with the theme from Wonderland, one of the most important technologies that we all rely on every single day, that we don't really celebrate as much as we should, is the keyboard, right? We use...
No, I hate my keyboard.
But you need it.
I know, but I don't like my keyboard.
Think how much time we spend typing.
Actually, who knew I was so emotional about my keyboard?
I know. I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation and work through some of your problems with the keyboard. So, typewriter keyboards, alphanumeric keyboards, were invented very late. It's surprising. We should have been able to invent typewriter keyboards in the 1600s or 1700s, but in fact they weren't invented until the late 1800s. And the idea for it came from music. Again, we had musical keyboards for almost 2,000 years before typewriters were invented, and then we had the clavichords and harpsichords and pianofortes and so on, player pianos. And finally, people began to think, wait, we could take this metaphor of using all 10 of your fingers to create notes and switch it over into letters and numbers. And the first typewriter was actually called the writing harpsichord.
That's
so it came
interesting.
directly
Beautiful.
from
It's
music,
actually
right?
quite beautiful. So Kirk Miller's in, and he has this great observation: play is the fuel for all growth and creativity. So I work in GE, a company of engineers.
Right.
Are engineers playful? I mean, how do you think about how do you marry engineering and play being the fuel of all creativity and growth?
I know a lot of engineers. They play a lot of video games. First
Yeah.
off, I would like to just make it clear. But I think actually that's one of the things that has started to change, is that our perception of the tech sector generally is actually much more playful than we would have thought 30 years
Yeah.
ago. You think about the campuses, a
Yeah.
lot of the big tech companies.
But you're right. They're very playful.
They're very playful, and I think that's one of the. I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that the volleyball courts and the foosball tables and the musical instruments that are in these offices are a perk of the success of those
or
companies.
frivolous.
But I think that they're actually one of the reasons why those companies are so
that's
successful.
so interesting. Yeah.
Because they've created an environment where the mind is constantly at play, even if it's doing serious work.
Well, I found this great picture on like from How We Got to Now of
Yes.
Stephen next to young Thomas Edison, and they're like separated at birth. Really,
It
I mean,
is.
it's amazing, the doppelganger. But Thomas Edison and GE was born out of Thomas Edison's brain, and we went and did some research. Thomas Edison wasn't very playful.
Right.
Did you find anything differently? I mean, he just seemed to, again, it just seemed to be all serious work. And Hollywood ended up happening in Los Angeles because he couldn't see his way to more playful applications of it.
Edison is I wrote a bit about Edison in How We Got to Now, and he was a very interesting figure. He's an example, actually, one of the ways in which the story is often mistold, in the sense that he's often credited as the inventor of the light bulb, when in fact there were multiple inventors of the light bulb. It was very much a network invention. But what Edison did brilliantly, which I think we live with the legacy of every day, is he created an environment in that workspace, in that lab. He kind of created the first innovation lab. And one of the key things that he did was he brought together a lot of different disciplines.
So it was very collaborative
and very collaborative and very diverse in terms of the fields of expertise that were kind of coming up with these ideas in the lab, and that was a big breakthrough.
So there's observation from Heather or Menegard. Sorry, Heather, if I'm getting it wrong. That despite all this, we're taught to be serious and stop playing.
Yeah.
What are you learning about education? How have you changed? Your parenting skills. You're the father of 3 sons.
3 sons. Yeah. We we sometimes do tell them to stop playing because they would play video games all day long.
And there seems a whole thread going on this. People really picking up that we're like taking play away from our kids.
Well,
maybe.
I went through this wonderful experience with my youngest son, who at the time was 9 when we did this, that I wrote about in a piece on Medium that people can find if they are interested in. Where we spent last summer, designing a board game together, and from scratch. Like, we came up with the whole kind of concept for it. We sat there kind of brainstorming what the rules should be, and made a little kind of rough board with magic marker and cardboard, and cut out some cards and things like that. And that process of collaborating with your kid and dreaming up a game is an incredible educational experience. It's a great bonding experience.
Well, you had a great quote I loved. You said, the process brought out the child in you and the adult in your child. Well, I just thought that was so poetic.
Kids are experts at games, and so they're sitting there being like, Dad, that'll never work. And that dynamic is great. But the other thing about it, and you've written about this concept of emergence, when you're designing a game, you have to go through this exercise of saying, okay, I think with these rules and these objectives and this board, that with all those different variables, it's going to be a great game. And then you sit down and you play it the first time,
and it stinks.
And it's terrible. It
well,
it
you
only
said you
lasts
needed
for
to put tension into the system.
Yeah, or it's too easy, or it's too hard, or it's not interest. There's not enough strategy, and so the game properties are an emergent property in the sense of these rules you've created, and then you have to modify those rules and tinker with them. That's the kind of trial and error that the other person was talking about.
So we're talking about Wonderland, talking with Stephen Johnson. Feel free to comment, add your questions. We're trying to go in and out. I wanted to quote part of the book and ask you a question about games. You said on page 203, for all the students that are following along, quote, if you were an aspiring futurologist, I think it's in Chessolis.
Oh, Cecilis.
Cecilis, who was...
He had lots of different names.
He sort of helped invent chess.
Yeah,
or the
popularized
father,
the rules of chess.
He was the father of chess, popularized it. You said, So if you were a futurologist in his day, if you were looking for clues about the future of invention and commerce, perhaps even a future where virtual encyclopedias would one day be written and edited by millions of people around the world, a good place to start would be by studying the games people play for fun and the evolution of rules of how they govern those. So, like, how do we think about games in that way? And then based on that, what are you seeing in the future based on the games we're playing now?
Well, it's a great question. So part of the point there is that games are one of the first examples of really open source forms developing. So most games, like chess, evolved over many, many centuries in many countries, with the rules being kind of no one owned. There was no proprietary ownership of chess, the game, and people kept tweaking with it. In fact, when Cecilus was writing, the queen was very weak as a piece. It didn't have the kind of power in the rules of the game, and then in the 1500s, 1600s.
They just didn't appreciate her power. I'm
no,
sure.
I mean, actually, they think it actually was a response to Queen Isabella in Spain, that she was suddenly more powerful, and they decided to modify the piece.
Yes.
Right? So the idea that you could have these products, in a sense, that are developed by many people around the world, kind of tinkering with them, adding features, was actually a really new idea. And one of the first places where that happened was games.
So
now we see it with
the way we
open source and all over the world. What in terms of games now? I mean, what we saw last summer, Pokemon Go, right?
Yeah.
If augmented reality is coming to mainstream society in the next 10 years,
see this future of just layers and layers on
I think
reality.
it's likely that it will happen, and we'll look back and say the first time this happened on a mass level was the game.
So Mickey McManus, great designer, founder of Maya, put a question in, and this idea of what's the future, but he asked a really great version of that. He said, how has your view of the past changed in the work that you do? I mean, you have to draw those threads from the past to the present to the future. So have you changed how you think about history?
Many ways. I mean, I guess I have come to appreciate how many of things that we think of, or kind of creative approaches that we think of as being very modern, like for instance open source, actually have long, kind of deep roots in history if you go back and look at it, and also how this is, as you said, a big theme of Wonderland, how global so much of innovation is. That that you had here, you had these foundational ideas that were coming from the kind of meeting of Iraq, what modern day Iraq, and Paris, that were coming together in the form of those early automatons and the idea of programmability. That there was always this, at least in the last several thousand years, there's been a deeply kind of global, diverse.
Yeah, and they weren't tethered with an internet to
right. They were actually able to get.
What were they getting in a boat and taking the ideas?
Well, actually, there's a chapter in Wonderland about the history of the spice trade, which is really the beginning of global marketplaces for these entirely frivolous flavors that aren't nutritious at all. They're just interesting taste on the tongue.
Magical.
And there's evidence that cloves, which we know only came from the Spice Islands off the coast of Indonesia, that cloves had traveled in like 2000 BC all the way from the Spice Islands to the modern day Middle East, at a time in which no human being had ever traveled that far.
But somehow the
spice the interest of these tastes was so powerful that
the shiny new thing was a spice.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jeff Slotnick asked that he'd love some advice about how to build a more playful, creative environment within our company. Now, as a writer, I assume you have a very solitary existence, but you had to study a lot of companies. You're seeing what works. Give Jeff a view of what you think might work.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I've seen a lot of, which I think is really powerful, is a lot of the people that I've studied over the years in my books, one of the characteristics they have is that they have a lot of hobbies. And that they have their main thing that they're working on, but they have 6 other things. I mean, Darwin was like this. Ben Franklin, I wrote about Invention of Air, of course, famously was like this. They have all these different interests. And it's precisely because they have so many different interests that they're so creative, because for all the reasons we've discussed. So part of it is creating a workspace where people bring in those hobbies, right? Where they're not just sitting at their desk and get to work and file this thing. You're doing this thing. It's like what is the full kind of 360-degree version of yourself and your interests, and that there should be room for that at work as well.
And then Lynn Corker, building on that, she asked, what's the best way to communicate that play at work is effective? And obviously you're a great communicator. How would you advise somebody who's struggling, they want to bring their whole self to work, but people, I know, I have colleagues sometimes who will be, you come in with a new idea and it's like, that's a cartoon.
Right.
Or you'll come in with a passion for something, well, that's just dabbling. Or we take that at home, do that on the off hours. How would you advise Lynn to communicate?
Well, I think some of these stories are really powerful when you look at the history of it. I mean, Steve Jobs started off working at Atari. That was his first real job. With video games, were a big inspiration for the first generation of people who created personal computers in the first place. The possibility of playing games on a screen got people thinking about.
They couldn't have even
idea.
imagined the gaming we're doing now.
Right,
Back in the days of Pong. And
but that's why I tried to build this book out of so many different specific examples of cases where ideas that came into the world under the kind of rubric of play then developed into much sturdier and
so
serious
I'm hearing
ideas.
you say to Lynn, like the idea of being able to pull on these stories to say, hey, did you realize the Industrial Revolution actually started with tapestry?
Right.
And that gave root to, so maybe the storytelling, give everybody take a couple of stories and have them be your narrative.
There are about 6,000 stories in Wonderland. You can choose whichever four you find most interesting.
I'm going to quote Wonderland, page 281. You say, quote, when the world surprises us with something, our brains are wired to pay attention. Psychologists have long understood that this appetite is an integral part of the human mind. Countless studies of newborn infants have shown that before they can crawl or grasp or communicate, we seek out surprising phenomena in our environment. There's this idea you raise of a novelty bonus that allows us to learn from new. I just thought that was so well, well put, but it's this need to seek out something new. It's genetically coded in our makeup.
And by the way, it's beginning to be coded into artificial intelligence too. This is one of the ways in which we train computers now to be more human-like in their intelligence, is to give them a bunch of information about the world, let them make predictions about what will happen next, and then when they're wrong with those predictions, you encode the system so that it pays extra attention to those mistakes. It's that kind of learning from mistakes.
Yeah.
And what play does, in a sense, is takes that interest in having our expectations be challenged or surprised, and puts it within kind of safe boundaries, right?
Yeah.
We evolved brains that were interested in being surprised so that we would learn from surprising events. And, a tiger jumping out of the bush and attacking us is very surprising.
In New York City, it would be very surprising.
What play does is let you rehearse those kind of moments of surprise with the stakes being lower.
Yeah.
Music, in a way, is this kind of controlled environment of surprise. When we don't like the pop song, it's because it sounds too familiar.
Yeah.
When we listen to completely atonal music, we can't find a pattern in it all, and so we're not surprised by it because it just seems like noise to us. What works for music is in that middle zone where it's kind of surprising and kind of not, and that seems to be the zone where people learn the most effectively.
So a couple of questions coming. Keep them coming. We're talking with Stephen Johnson about Wonderland here at the Changemakers Book Club. If you're just joining, Selva asks if game planners or game organizers at work can make a good fit for leaders. Is there anything interesting in the way game organizers are thinking?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually writing a little bit more about this in the new book that I'm working on, which is about decision making and complex decision making, long-term decision making. And so I looked a little bit at the history of games as a way of when you're dealing with complex situations. It really starts with war games, right?
Yeah.
The military kind of pioneered this in a sense. You've got these complicated situations where lots of different variables are coming into play. How do you predict what the best strategy is? How do you predict what potential outcomes there might be? And rather than just sitting there and trying to think what they should be, if you create that game structure where people are playing the different parts, kind of role playing, really.
That's interesting.
And also, if you do multiple iterations of it, right? It's not just about doing it once and be like, okay, that's what's going to happen.
Again, it's that emergent thinking. You're trying to put more options out and learn from it.
Exactly right. And
the feedback loop I'm hearing you talk about.
Again, with games, the beauty of it is that people are doing very complex thinking, and yet they don't even realize they're doing it because it's fun. There's something about that game structure that pulls people in.
It's a good segue to Rick Dreyfuss at is a GE. Looks like Rick's a GE colleague, and he says many of us at GE use games to improve collaboration, but the games we use are very focused on generating outcomes. Is there a middle ground between the serious games and the purely social ping pong table or hobbies in the office, as you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think they're both kind of valuable parts of the spectrum. I mean, on the ping pong side of it, in Wonderland, I have a whole riff about spaces that are designed just for kind of recreation, like bars and taverns and coffee houses.
I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah, it's fun. I could have written a whole book
and
on
the fact that
thing.
people didn't like to go into nature.
Yeah,
That nature was scary.
The invention of nature as
yeah.
a play space, all that stuff. People used to find mountains offensive to
Yes,
the eye. They were
yeah.
like asked to have their eyes blindfolded.
They
as
were like
passed
wart.
by.
They called them warts, right?
It
was crazy.
So it turns out that those kinds of spaces have been very important because when you create an environment where the people are more casual, where people's identity is more fluid, maybe sometimes where there's alcohol involved, all these different things, or coffee, new ideas are more likely to kind of percolate. And so that's the kind of role of the ping pong table kind of game environment where we're not actually trying to specifically to solve this problem that we've created this role-playing game to solve. We're just hanging out and it's more relaxed, but in that kind of fluid social space, you're open to new ideas in a way that you wouldn't.
Well, you may be
normally
learning
do.
from other senses, I hear you
Right,
say.
right.
So there's a common question that's coming up that let's take a minute and go into it about. So give some examples of how you approach play, and I'll offer while you're thinking about it. I mean, this book has really made me think about, one, that I don't have enough play in my life. So
Okay, I'm glad to.
I now have homework to do. I'm making
the best
myself
kind of
accountable
homework.
right here. I mean, I look around, I'm in one of the rooms I love to use at GE, and I've got toys.
Right. There
And
you
one
go.
of the things
Good.
we've tried to do here are like field trip Fridays where you go to sort of crazy different places and try to do that. But I think the idea of play is something that I need to rediscover. Have you had to rediscover it, and what do you do now for play?
Well, I guess I have always had an appetite for it, and the big element of play in my life is that I'm a amateur musician, and I have a whole recording studio in my house and a bunch of guitars and keyboards, and I've probably recorded 100 songs over the years that I've kind of written and played all the instruments on. And I think maybe like 8 people have heard those songs. It's this beautiful thing because
for you.
it's just for me, and it's very liberating to have something where you have great passion and no ambition.
I love that. Great passion and no ambition. Is
just-
that maybe another definition of play?
Well, sometimes it can be, yeah. I mean, I think when you have a lot of ambition, sometimes it cuts into the playfulness of it,
Okay,
right?
so
You know
that's
what I
a
mean?
tension. Maybe you got to get that
Yeah,
balance right.
and so I
maybe
just-
do you need ambition to play?
Well, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't think you always do. I think that's part of the thing. One of the things that makes
Yeah.
it, playful is that you're liberated from that. But for me, that music time has, it just, I'll sit there and crank away on a
Yeah.
book for hours and hours, and then I'll go and I'll be working on a song, and I'm very focused and into it, but it's a completely different way of thinking and kind of being in the world for a few hours.
Yeah.
And it's ended up it's made me a better listener of music, but now I'm writing a little bit more about music in this book and a few
Interesting.
others, so it's helped me in that
Well,
way. as well.
maybe for a future discussion, there's so much I want to talk to you about. I know time's of the essence, but maybe for a future discussion, we'd pit your music against the music that's being created by artificial intelligence and
Yes.
machine learning and see if we can
I'm
distinguish
sure
or what we learn.
The AI music is already better than my music.
Do you have a few more minutes for us to
Yeah,
keep
yeah,
going?
I'll do it.
Thanks for the questions. A lot of good
Great
thinking. It
stuff.
seems like people are really interested in this idea of play at work. How do you take it into work? So I think you've really hit on something.
Good.
But I want to ask you how you work.
Yeah.
What's your writing process? How do you allow for creativity?
Yeah.
It is it's seemingly from afar a very insular kind of job, and that it's you and a computer, I assume. But take us through your process.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that was really nice about making the TV show is that here I've spent all this time writing about the importance of collaboration and networks of innovation and so on in my work. But the truth is my writing process, as you say, is very solitary. So making a show is very collaborative, and
Yeah.
that was a nice thing to change the pace. But in general, once I actually am writing a book, I have this kind of pretty systematic approach of trying to write 500 words a day. which is not very many words. That's 2 or 3 paragraphs. You can, if you know what you're saying, you can sometimes do it in 30 minutes.
Yeah. Do they have to be 500 good words?
They could just be random words taken from the dictionary.
Yeah.
No, they have to be B+ words.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
they don't.
So there's a process and a
there's
formula.
Total confidence that there are many cycles of editing that are coming down the way.
Yeah.
So I used to be much more precious about getting the sentence perfect
Yeah.
on the page, but now I'm like, I just write 500 words a day, and if you do that every day for 3 or 4 months, there's a book. I
Yeah.
mean, you have enough words for a book, and then you have to go back and refine it, stuff like that.
So people are recognizing you. They've known you for a while through your books, but now people are recognizing you because they've seen how we got to now on PBS, on Netflix. Just walk us through? So how we got to now leads to Wonderland. To now you're writing a book on long-term complex problem solving.
Yeah, decision making.
Is there a common thread, or you just wake up one day and go, I need to do problem solving?
Well, actually, the decision making book is one that I came up with and sold the proposal for almost 10 years ago, like 8 years ago, and then I got kind of sidetracked and started doing How We Got to Now, and so it's been sitting in the background, which is a great way to work, by the way. This is another thing about my
so
method is I always have, like right now, I am technically working on really 3 books.
You're like an Intel super processing.
Well, no, I'm not at all. I wish I were, but no, I have these background projects that I'm focused on this one, but there's another one in the back, and there's another one behind that one. And so what that means is when you stumble across something, when you have that kind of chance discovery, researching one thing, turns out you stumble across something that's useful to Project B or Project C, you know where to put it. You at least have a place to put it.
But see, I'm hearing you, I get back to that, you're this nimble mind. You're able to maybe to recognize patterns and make connections?
But I built up a lot of techniques for, like in...
So there are tricks of the trade.
There are tricks of the trade. I mean, one of the things that I wrote about a little bit in Where Good Ideas Come From is I have this thing called the Spark File where I write down
Spark File's a good idea.
every single random idea that I stumble across, even if I don't know where it goes, and I try and go back and revisit that whole massive document. It's now like a 70,000 word document. It's longer than almost any of the books.
Maybe you need some machine learning to
to
spark
surface.
Spark
No,
File.
I've experimented with that as well. Don't even get me started on that. But a lot of times what happens is the idea that you had, this is the kind of slow hunch idea that I wrote about, the idea that you had in 2011 that was just a hunch of something, just a piece of something, didn't fully make sense to you in 2011, but when you revisit it in 2017, suddenly because of something that's changed in the world or something that's changed in you or a new collaborator you have, it makes all the sense in the world. And we forget those hunches. Like those are the first things that get kind of left
But it's
behind.
kind of like Dear Diary for your hunches. I mean, you're making 2 really great points. I want to make sure we capture this idea of a spark file. Just sparks capture them. And this slow,
and put them all in one place. Don't try and file them
Okay.
away, because if you file them away, then you never find them.
Okay, and then slow hunch. You're very well known. People in the comments we were getting, a lot of people referenced your slow hunch theory. So what's this idea? Just it's constantly building, right?
It's the anti-eureka moment, right?
Okay.
So everybody talks about the light bulb moment, the eureka moment, the aha moment, but
it's a lot of pressure.
It doesn't really happen that way. That what happens with really big ideas is that they start in this hunch-like state. But there's something interesting there. What could I do with that? And it's people who keep those hunches alive for long periods of time and continue to develop them and make connections, or partner with people who can fill out the hunch in some way. Those tend to be the biggest ideas in the long run.
So a couple questions before we wrap up. But again, we're looking at Wonderland. Obviously, talking to the great writer and now television host, Stephen Johnson, and Thomas Edison, young Thomas Edison lookalike.
Right. That's my backup. I can always be a young Thomas Edison impersonator.
We may need some Thomas Edison impersonators.
Right.
So one of the people who wrote in, his name is Wynn Burke, or her name, Wynn Burke. If you could synthesize all of your books and musings, like Slow Hunches and some of the you now have a receptive global audience, Wynn is saying, what would be the major principles you'd want people to take away? Is there a major theme? Wynn says, or a narrative, John Hagel's narrative. What is that?
I mean, I think the 2 big ones there are a lot of different themes, but the 2 that I'm really interested in now that run throughout all the book, and that we're hoping, by the way, to make a season 2 of How We Got to Now, based on Wonderland. And the big themes in that and in Wonderland are twofold. One, the creative, playful side of innovation. That when we think about things like STEM, we are so focused on we have to learn how to do science and math and engineering. Well, there is this creative side to it.
Oh, I'm so passionate. You're so right.
And if you don't emphasize that, one, it's less fun, and 2, we lose something.
It's our humanity is the creativity.
And the extent to which diversity drives innovation.
Yeah.
That when we have different worldviews, different cultural background, different genders,
Yeah.
when you have there's
Another
so
great
much
one.
science to
So
support
powerful.
how much smarter groups are, more creative, more inventive when they're diverse. I think right now that's a pretty important message.
Yeah, it's a really important one. So we asked people to bubble up their favorite question, but so
Okay.
people have been voting it up, and a lot of the other questions that came in. I'm gonna maybe we'll wrap up with this, but why is it so hard for people to change?
I think it may be related to the diversity thing.
I mean, you were expecting you're an expert on everything now, right?
Yeah,
So now
so
you're suddenly.
while I've not written about this, I'm going to just tell you
Yeah,
my
yeah.
random theories that I have. No, I think it's related to when we are in, filter bubbles or echo chambers or places where we're only surrounded by people who have the same shared values or perspectives that we have. You just get on this path, and it's hard to imagine another way
Yeah.
of looking at the world.
Is it comfort?
Yeah, it's just easier. I mean,
Yeah.
it is obviously embracing a different perspective, challenging your
It's
assumptions.
a lot of energy to do this.
It is. It's a lot easier to just be like, well, this is the way I did it yesterday. I'm going to do it this way today.
How do you force yourself to change?
It's just in the nature of my work, because I like to write about different topics. I'm constantly diving into different fields where by definition I'm not an expert. I'm dropping into places where I'm like, I wrote a book about neuroscience.
Yeah,
I
but
have
I
no
think that
training
makes you an expert of a certain kind of pattern recognition, of connectivity. I mean, there's
Right.
probably an expertise you have to
Or
do
I'm
that.
a dilettante who just has no real skills, but one way or the other. But no, there is something liberating in showing up in a field without a lot of
I
expertise.
totally agree.
And you're able to perceive what's really interesting. It's so interesting
Yeah.
to get back to the parody of me.
That's the name of your next book, maybe, or the
It's
book
So
after
Interesting
this one.
by
It's
Stephen
so
Johnson. That's good. All right,
interesting.
there we go.
So, look, thank you. I can't endorse Wonderland enough. I'm not just saying it
Thank you.
because you're here. I think you've really unlocked for me a need to get more play. One of the things Stephen and I agreed before we sat down is that we're going to give away some signed copies of
Yes.
Wonderland. If you happen to have another passionate book of Stephen's that you're passionate about, maybe we can convince him to sign one of those. But we also have some I put out here. We've done these fun scientific kits at GE called Labracadabra, and I thought we could give away some of those as well,
Great.
which is science as play. But what question do we want to, what thought do you want to seed for the book giveaway?
Well, I think it would be good if people would share their own, what's, your routine for bringing play into work that you've seen in your office or in your own personal life. Because I think both Beth and I would be fascinated to hear those stories. And the best examples I will personally sign and inscribe to you or whoever you want it to be dedicated to these books for the best answers.
The best answer, could we maybe give one of your songs away too as part of it?
That will discourage people
Well,
from
I don't know. I
submitting
think
their
that might
answers,
be good. So, last question. I'll let someone's asked. So we're doing this as a series. So next month we're going to be talking to someone you know well, Joey Ito.
Oh, great.
Who's the head of the
that's a great
MIT
book, isn't
Media
it?
Lab, and his book Whiplash. And in fact, he talks a lot about emergence. And I wish we had time. Maybe another time we can all get together and talk about emergence.
I'll tune in and pester you guys with questions.
Great.
Online.
Well, anyway, Stephen, you're such a great sport for being here. Thanks
Thanks,
so
Beth. It's
much. And
great.
thank you all.
Thanks,
We'll
everyone.
keep the conversation going, and we'll see you back here regularly. So thanks a lot for joining.